The National Endowment for Liberty presents At Issue, the in-depth forum on freedom in America today. Hello, I'm Mike Hayes. The host of At Issue is the physician, author, and former member of Congress, Ron Paul. Ron?
Thank you, Mike. Today we're going to look at the one government agency people come into contact with more than any other, the U.S. Postal Service. Rates are going up and service standards are going down. We'll try to figure out why and if there's anything we can do about it.
Our program today, as usual, will consist of our probe report on what's at issue, reactions from a group of average citizens somewhere in the country, and an in-depth analysis of the entire subject by our panel of experts. We'll begin our probe report, The Mail Monopoly, following this brief message.
This is one in a series of programs that takes a fresh look at critical issues affecting how you live and how you use your natural rights as an individual to make decisions about your life. At Issue is brought to you by the National Endowment for Liberty, because we agree with Thomas Jefferson, that government governs best that governs least. The National Endowment for Liberty is a nonprofit, nonpartisan educational project. We do not accept state or federal funds. In fact, we don't count on any agency of government at any level to keep this program on the air. Instead, we count on the generous gifts of individuals, people just like you. Write to us at Post Office Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058, or call us at 1-800-333-3545 and ask for extension 909. If you missed any part of this message, keep your pencil and paper handy. This information will be repeated.
It's being done with prisons in several states. It's been proposed for the passenger rail system. In Virginia, there are plans for a new highway. And in Michigan, one small, near-bankrupt town has done it with almost all their local services. It's called privatization. And what it's all about is turning services once provided by government over to private businesses. Is it a good idea?
Here we are giving this kind of good counsel to the East European community, explaining to them the virtues of private ownership and competition, and simultaneously the post office announces that it's going to take first-class mail rates up to 30 cents and that it cannot guarantee you any more under 3-day delivery if it's over 400 miles. That's about a 1-hour plane flight. And I think it's a fundamental contradiction that we have in practice here at home when we know all of the deficiencies of government-owned monopolies.
The Postal Service does compete with private businesses in some areas, such as parcel delivery and overnight letters.
It's very fascinating that where they have allowed that competition, the great majority of consumers have chosen the private competitors instead of the post office. The post office has a very tiny share of both those markets. And so we can see from that experience the public prefers a private competitive market instead of a government monopoly, because when given the choice, that's where they go.
No, we can't compete entirely on an equal level. So what we do is we use our system to the extent that we can provide access to an expedited service for the American public and for the smaller businessman. We don't have the right to give volume discounts because our prices are regulated. So that we're in a different field. We use our resources in our system out there, the postal system of the United States, and so we're in competition, but we're not in competition in all cases.
If competition works in parcel delivery, why don't we have it in first-class mail?
Well, we don't, because under existing law it's illegal. And in fact, there have even been instances where people tried to perform services between businesses in some metropolitan communities, and they came in and got their knuckles rapped for doing that.
The mail monopoly laws go to great lengths to protect the post office from competitors, large and small.
This is my mailbox. I paid for it. I'm responsible for it. If someone knocks it over, I have to fix it or go to a hardware store and buy a new one. But I don't really have free use of it because it's illegal for anyone other than the post office to put anything in it. If my neighbor across the street wants to leave me a note and she puts it in the mailbox, she's committed a crime. I think that's silly.
Well, it's true and strange that you don't have control over what goes into your own mailbox. The government controls what goes into your mailbox. And I think they should have a system that opens that up more to the choice of the person who owns it as to what kind of system he wants. They try to talk about security But the funny thing is the Postal Service is very insecure. For the financial community, whenever they want to send something that's sensitive, they never send it by the Postal Service. They send it by private alternative delivery systems.
Back recently, Cub Scouts, I believe in New York, were going to deliver postcards, or not postcards, but Christmas greeting cards. And this was going to be a fundraiser for the Cub Scouts too. And of course they were doing it at less cost than the post office charges for delivery of first-class mail, but at least they were going to guarantee prompt delivery. And the post office moved in and shut down their operation.
It doesn't make a lot of sense economically to have very many more than one person deliver, for example, to my 2-block cul-de-sac. And certainly if you start breaking that up and unbundling all of those pieces of mail, you then have the opportunity to make them all inefficient and unsustainable from that point of view, from an economic point of view.
Well, the people who argue for the postal monopoly, that's just a special interest pleading. They want to protect their nest. See, they don't want to be subject to competition. They want all the consumers to be forced to come to them and have to take their service. And they don't want to have these day-to-day pressures and day-to-day incentives like everyone else does. But this is America. Everyone's subject to competition, and the Postal Service should be subject to competition as well.
In our time, first-class postal rates have risen much faster than inflation. You could mail a letter for just 3 cents as late as 1957. In 1991, the rate is scheduled to go up to 30 cents. Have the increased costs resulted in better service?
You know, just a few weeks ago, the Postal Service announced that they were delaying their guidelines for mail delivery because they couldn't keep up with the old standards. So they were, 1-day delivery in some areas was going to become 2 days, and 2-day delivery was going to become 3 days. They followed that up a few weeks later with this postal rate increase of 20%.
But would a privatized, competitive system work any better?
Repeal the monopoly would be a very simple step, and then the postal system would still be there, and we could see who comes in. Also, they could just very simply give the postal system to the workers, give each an equal share of stock. They would then be the owners. They could run it. They know the system. I'm sure that they would provide a very good system with lower costs and better service once they were subject to the same incentives of the market as everyone else is.
I think that in that kind of a climate, you would indeed see competition emerge. But I think you'd see a leaner, meaner, competitive postal service. And I don't think it'd be put out of business, because I think the employees are smart enough to say, hey, you know, we have all these assets at our disposal, plus the tradition of people patronizing the post office. And if we can just get into that kind of a competitive mode, such as United Parcel Service, we're still in business, and we're in business for a profit and at better performance and less cost to the consumer.
The Constitution gives Congress the authority to operate a postal service, but does not grant a monopoly. The first Postmaster General was Benjamin Franklin. What would Franklin say about today's postal service?
Well, Ben Franklin would be horrified, of course, of the service today, and I think Ben Franklin would marvel that here 2 centuries after his time, that the Postal Service is taking as long to deliver mail as Ben Franklin took to deliver mail, and that was before we had air transportation, before we had rail transportation, and before we had superhighways.
Remember when life was simpler and problems were solvable? When you could rely on good common sense and your own honesty and initiative to see you through? That was back before government regulation got so tangled up in our public and private lives, before paperwork and arbitrary rules took over and individual choice was locked out. The National Endowment for Liberty believes that most of our problems cannot be solved by government, that too much government is in itself a problem, not a solution. These programs are made possible as a public service by people who believe that moral and political rights go hand in hand with economic freedom. Write to us at Post Office Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058, or call us at 1-800-333-3545 and ask for extension 909. We are the National Endowment for Liberty. Liberty can set you free.
The mailman that we used to have all the time before he retired, he was like clockwork. 1 o'clock, your mail was there. He did it 1 o'clock, 1 o'clock. Now, what changed is they put someone else on one day, someone else on the next day, someone stayed 2 weeks. Everything changed.
Each week on At Issue, we show the probe report you've just seen to a group of citizens somewhere in the United States. What you're watching are the unrehearsed reactions of a group of people in Southfield, Michigan, to the probe report, The Mail Monopoly.
On the other side of your block and do your mail. So your mail changed to 3 to 3:30, and I find that to be true.
My mother, every year that there's an increase in the stamps, I mean, they're cutting down. I mean, they're on a fixed income, so it's very hard for her to send to all the relatives and friends because it gets to be very costly.
Mail carrier wouldn't walk up to the door because there was snow in the front of the house. So she would walk up and down the street, and we didn't get our mail for 3 weeks. Unless you had your walk shoveled, I mean, you could be right up to the door, but if it wasn't the front sidewalk in front of the house, she would just walk right by. But then in the summer, she'd walk across the grass.
So we get our mail sometimes after 5, and when you're waiting for something, it's like, where's the mail already?
You know, the mail, you know, it used to be like your newspaper boy, you know, as soon as school was out, you know, by 3:30 or whatever, you had your newspaper. And the mail, it always seems like, you know, you could count, okay, if we're going to get it at 2 o'clock, then every day we expect it to be around 2 o'clock. But it seems to be changing. So sometimes that's a little just frustrating, but it's no big thing because usually it's bills that are coming and not money in the mail, so they can wait, you know.
Myself personally, I think anything the government has anything to do with, they screw it up. They have in the past, and they'll always continue to do it.
You can't get the post office to walk in your door at
Yeah,
5
they won't
o'clock
pick up.
to pick up when you can get Federal Express or Emory or somebody else that will pick up at 5 o'clock, or you call them and you say, hey, it's ready, or you call a 1-800 number for an automatic pickup.
Yeah.
They
And
can
dialing
have
your
them to come
touchtone
to your
phone.
office every day.
That's not the reason I used it. I used it because I had an emergency where I absolutely had to get something somewhere overnight. I just remembered that commercial. Pretty shallow, isn't it? I don't know. I guess I just trusted that company that they would get it there overnight, and it
Did they
had
get
to
it
be
there?
there. They sure did.
I've cut down, I would say, 3/4 of my Federal Express by use of a fax machine.
Yeah.
So I think they're going to have to start lowering prices because their business is going to start hurting.
Okay.
That's competition right there.
And we don't know if competition would improve the service. I mean, it's certainly proved itself out in the other business factors of anything else. And it could improve your service. It may not necessarily mean the cost would go up. That's not necessarily true, providing that it's opened up to all people, businesses that want to get involved in it. Competition will keep the price down.
Well, there's not much doubt where people in Michigan stand. Let's see how our panel of experts feels about competition for the Postal Service. Dr. Douglas Adey is a professor at Ohio University and the author of the book, The Monopoly Mail, Privatization of the U.S. Postal Service. Michelle Easley is an attorney. She's general counsel of the Citizens Legal Alliance, an arm of the think tank Citizens for a Sound Economy. And our host and permanent panelist is the chairman of the National Endowment for Liberty, Ron Paul. Ron, is it time for a change in the way we handle the mail in this country?
Not only do I think it's time for a change, I think it's past time. I have the personal opinion that if one is opposed to competition, it's sort of like being un-American. I think America is well known for competition in the free market, and yet we as Americans have accepted a monopoly here for a couple hundred years. And we made a few intrusions into the monopoly with overnight delivery packages, but certainly not with first-class mail. So I think it's time to Americanize mail delivery, and that is get the competition in here. And I'd like to get a few opinions from the panel here on how they feel about it.
Before the Eastern Europeans overtake us.
That's right. Yes, certainly.
Well, Ron, I think you're absolutely right. Here we're seeing the Postal Service increasing consumers' prices, decreasing their service. The Postal Service right now is losing about $4 million a day, despite generous federal subsidies. I think if we allow competition in, you'll see more of what you're seeing in in overnight delivery and package delivery. We're the Postal Service right now. In package delivery, I think they have something like 3% of the market, with UPS providing over 90% of our service.
That's right. You know, the question that has been thrown out to me the most when this subject comes up is the very sincere concern by many about what would happen to the delivery service in the rural areas. Everybody's concerned, you know, that if we don't have the government doing it, the rural areas won't get the same service as the city areas. Now, I happen to have a personal opinion that maybe we shouldn't worry too much about that, because everybody makes their choices, and the market seems to do a very good job in delivering other services regardless of where we live. And therefore, is that the obligation of government to always aim for and strive for egalitarianism? For some reason, I think that when you strive for that, you get an equal society, but it seems like we get equally poor delivery service or whatever service the government provides. But how serious is this challenge about the service to the rural areas?
Well, I don't think there's much of a problem with service to the rural areas. It's profitable to deliver packages to rural areas. It's profitable to deliver overnight mail to rural areas. The telephone lines go to rural areas, and rural areas get good service in this country. Even the third-class mailers, the private third-class mailers, and there are some that are excluded from the government monopoly, deliver third-class mail, which is sometimes called junk mail by some people, into these high-cost areas, cheaper than the subsidized rates that the Postal Service charges for this mail. So I think there's really no problem and no worry. And if by chance some people are still concerned, for about $26 million subsidy out of a budget of close to $40 billion for the Postal Service, we could ensure that the rural people would be adequately taken care of with at least as good service as they have right now.
There isn't that much of a cost differential either between providing urban service and providing rural service. I think that the costs are only about 15% different, so I don't think that you'll see that much of a decline in rural areas. As Doug said, there's still rural delivery in the package business and in the Federal Express business. And another option is the Postal Service claims they're losing money on these rural areas because urban delivery is subsidizing the rural areas. Well, allow competition into the rural areas and allow the Postal Service then to recoup some of their lost costs that they're losing to these areas.
You're absolutely right, Michelle. And Gene Del Polito, who represents the third-class mailers, has challenged the Postal Service in the hearings on privatization, which the government had, challenged them to relax the monopoly on third-class mail entirely. Right. They're willing to forego their subsidy. They're willing to give it up just for an opportunity to have their mail delivered by private mailers. And this is in rural areas, too.
Okay. The suggestion made on the tape by Peter Ferrara said that maybe one way for the transition would be to literally give the post office to the mail deliverers, the postmen, and let them run it as a private corporation. Do you consider this a good idea, or do you think we should be cautious about such a proposal?
I think this may be just a trifle too generous. We have employees that are earning close to $45,000 a year when you include their benefits. And I think the business is worth something and should be sold. Perhaps sold at a discount to employees to give them an incentive to support their business, but not given away.
You know, the idea of an employee-owned mail system is interesting. Maybe we'll come back to that thought. We'll return to more views and comments on the subject at issue in just a moment.
Throughout this series of programs, you will see ideas examined that affect every part of your life. We'll look at issues from a new angle, not from the left or the right, but from the perspective of individual liberty and responsibility. We believe our founding fathers were right. We are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these is the right to life, liberty, and property. We do not accept your money transferred through state or federal government agencies. Instead, this series is funded by direct voluntary gifts from individuals. We are the National Endowment for Liberty. Call us right now, 1-800-333-3545, extension 909. For a transcript of this program, specify the subject and send $5 in a stamped self-addressed envelope to P.O. Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058. The National Endowment for Liberty, providing information on America's most precious resource, individual freedom.
We're back, and during the break, Michelle Easley had some very interesting ideas about employee-owned mail service. Michelle?
Well, right now, Congressman Crane does have a bill that would turn the Postal Service over to its employees. A couple of the benefits of this is that you're giving the employees a bit of a windfall. I think they'd be getting something like $30,000 by privatizing it and turning it over to the employees. So you would reduce some of the definite employee opposition to privatizing the Postal Service. And it is important that you do provide some incentives to provide better mail service for consumers.
Yes, I would think this would be important because it's as much of a political football as it is an economic issue, because politically you have to overcome the hurdles of those who are lobbying and those who have a special interest in keeping the post office going. So it looks like something like that would be necessary, but maybe the compromise would be, as Doug suggested, a discount to those who have a so-called time investment in the post office where they could participate. But I'm not, I've never been totally convinced that the term employee ownership is equivalent to business ownership, board of directors, but I guess that can all be worked out in the marketplace. I'm sure there would have to be board of directors and profit motives, and it would be the ownership of the stock that would go to the individual. Is that the way you would understand it?
Well, it would be an initial allocation to the employees, but unless there were some constraints on transferability of shares, they could sell them after a particular time period, and then the shares would just simply pass into public hands and be owned by anyone.
Which could occur rather quickly in a
Sure.
free market,
Surely.
maybe overnight, practically speaking. And I happen to believe also that if you legalize the competition, that the transition would be rather rapid. Frequently I would jest that you don't have to abolish the post office. All you have to do is legalize competition. The post office would be gone in a short order. And I think that is the case. Now others argue that, I know Phil Crane argued that the post office would be there for a long time, but the competition in the market would determine that. I think an interesting point in the early part of the program was this point about the mailbox itself. Isn't this fascinating that we might go out and purchase a mailbox, put it up on our post, and we really don't own it? It's almost like it's the loss of respect and the understanding of private property rights that has introduced this mess that we have with the post office. So maybe all we have to do is turn the mailboxes back to private owners.
Well, this is a similar issue to the issue in the telephone industry, where at one point AT&T used to own all of our lines within our house. And then the court said they only owned the wire up to the house, and inside the house it was our wire. We could do with what we wanted with it. Cable companies are in the same issue. And the Postal Service has the same issue with the boxes. And I think that consistency in all of these issues would suggest that the owner owns his box and he can do with it whatever he wants.
But did this come up because the postman wanted to make sure that he didn't have to fight with a newspaper being in the box, or do you think there was an ulterior motive for this type of regulation and law?
That's hard to say. There's been some controversy with the third-class mailers in the newspapers now, though, as well, because you can deliver a newspaper to someone's doorstep, and you can deliver third-class pieces of mail in a newspaper. But as soon as you put an address on that advertisement, it becomes a letter and subject to the Postal Service monopoly. So the Postal Service is still trying to grab as much of their monopoly as they possibly can, and keeping with their jurisdiction over the mailboxes. There are a lot of charities and a lot of organizations like the Cub Scouts, like church groups, etc., that are willing to deliver some of their mail to these mailboxes, yet the Postal Service won't allow them to.
How did this come about, where they wrote the rule or the law that says we couldn't use the mailbox?
Well, the Postal Service interprets its own monopoly. And this is an anti-competitive and monopolistic practice.
Deliberate.
That's right.
Folks, our time's getting short and we need to wind this up. So let me ask each of you to comment on the short run for a moment. Doug 80, what's the next step? What's the very first thing we should do about the mail monopoly?
Well, my own opinion is that we ought to privatize the Postal Service, deregulate it, abolish the monopoly, and perhaps even break it up. But this is a positive thing, and so often I hear it's spoken of in negative terms. The communication industry is a very fast-growing industry. There are so many things happening in it, and the Postal Service could take its place in the communications industry. It could perhaps provide altogether different services from the ones that it's providing now. It could do things in many different ways, and it needs to be unshackled, and I simply cannot see it bound up the way it is, the way it's been bound almost for 300 years, really making a break and taking a place in the communications industry.
And Michelle Easley, what's your view on the best next step?
I think the best next step would be to relax the private express statutes and allow competition for the Postal Service. It's a very easy step. The Postal Service themselves can relax these statutes if they find it in the public interest. And I think the cost savings has been estimated between $4 and $12 billion of privatizing the Postal Service. I think this would give consumers wider choices, better delivery service, and lower costs.
And Ron?
Mike, I think it would be good if Congress would immediately pass a piece of legislation to make it legal for each of us to own our own mailbox and to use it the way we want. That would be a good step. And then, of course, legalize competition and allow private industry to compete with the government monopoly.
Well, that's where we'll have to leave it. I want to thank our panelists for being with us and you for watching. We'll be back next week with another vital topic at issue.
The National Endowment for Liberty would like to acknowledge the inspirational contribution of John Norris McGuire III and the sponsors of At Issue, whose generous support makes these programs possible.